This is lecture number DR017US11. This is the 17th of the Mega Genius lectures and the 11th lecture of the Uncommon Sense series. It was recorded on November 17, 2000. The title of this lecture is The 7 Secrets to Happiness. It is 29 minutes long. Copyright 2000 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
Who do you think was happier? Mahatma Gandhi, who owned a shawl, a loincloth, spectacles, and a wooden bowl, and virtually nothing else? Or multi-billionaire Howard Hughes, who bought and sold hotel casinos as if he were playing Monopoly? Here is a mega-truth. There is no true success in the absence of happiness. If you would like to be as happy as a puppy chasing sunbeams, or know someone who would, the genius formula indicates it's easier than you may think. It's all in how you think. Here is the secret, which is another mega-truth. Lasting happiness depends upon what one does, not what one has. Happiness is a natural state of life to a child. Unless particularly oppressed, he is not only happy at heart, but free in his expression of it. He does not even think about whether he is happy or not. He just is, and assumes that everyone else is too. A child will bask in the feeling of warm sunshine on his face, marvel at the wonder of thunder in the distance, run barefoot through the dewy grass, leap laughingly to welcome sudden sprinkles, and search about with delight for the rainbow being born, or about to be. For him, life is happiness, and happiness is the essence of life. But something changes. A few decades later he squints the harsh sun from his eyes, frowns at the approaching rain clouds, and silently curses the dew on his shoes. There is no longer a pot of gold at the end of any rainbow. For him, effort has become the essence of life. The sun still shines and the rain still falls, but something changed, drastically. Well, life and the world have not changed, but he certainly has. What happened? He made a few unintelligent decisions that destroyed the happiness he once knew and effectively prevented its recurrence, and that has made all the difference. His first major mistake was his failure to recognize that his happiness was directly nurtured by his ability to dream. As a happy child, he was on top of life. He could face its multifarious nature and still smile to himself. He even knew that he could change the world. It was not his happiness, however, that made him dream. It was his dreams that made him happy. In fact, he was no happier than he could dream and consider that his dreams could come true. Now, those who have lived long and erred often enough to discover unhappiness as their way of life are fond of teaching those about to follow in their footsteps that a youth and his daydreams cannot change the world, and that such visions of grandeur are mere foolishness. Yet what does the man who failed to retain and regain the happiness that he once had at his fingertips really know? Or more directly, if he is so smart, why isn't he happy? The truth is that the world has been appreciably changed, repeatedly. Thousands of times it has been significantly and beneficially influenced by free thinkers, and in every instance the impact was born as a single thought in the mind of one human being. To say that one cannot change the world is like saying one cannot invent the wheel. Well, somebody surely did. Nevertheless, more often sooner than later, the child who only yesterday basked, marveled, ran, leaped, and searched for rainbows was confronted by a rapid series of life's common, garden-variety type difficulties. It began to rain on his parade, and he began to wonder if life might occasionally be just a bit dangerous, and innocently, but fatally, took a single step backward. That was his second major mistake, because life was not as dangerous as it appeared, or as dangerous as he had been told, but it would never look quite the same to him again. His powers seemed to weaken, and the power of his environment seemed to strengthen. Thereafter, life seemed a little more difficult, a little less beautiful, and his dreams, which he did not entertain as much, had lost some of their magic. He even noticed he was not as happy, but what he would never notice in a millennium was that only he had done it, to himself. Happiness is not an external force that approaches and withdraws of its own volition. It is a state of mind that blooms or withers from within. Here is a mega truth. Regardless of one's riches, no one can be happy without a dream in their heart. In time, however, the young man who began to dream less will dream less and less, until finally he will dream no more. You will see it in the lost sparkle of his eyes. You will hear it in the tiredness of his voice. You will sense the absence in his heart. He will not be dead. He will just feel that way. And if the young man's decision to dream less was not enough to ensure his happiness, and it was, he dug his grave deeper. His third major mistake was his failure to recognize that the end never justifies the means. He decided to violate his own ethical code, and did. Although it may sometimes seem impossible to believe, every human being is essentially decent. Even so, through confusion, misunderstanding, or even insanity, he can erroneously choose to commit indecent acts. That results in a dichotomy of his basic decency versus the indecency of the acts. Violating one's ethical code does kick back. There is a law of retribution. The man who thinks that he can act against others on impulse and disregard his conscience as a separate meddling entity is mentally disconnected from his own life support system. He would be surprised to learn that his conscience is not something he has. It is actually the essence of himself. Here is another mega truth. To deny one's conscience is to deny oneself. To whatever extent he denies what he knows to be decent, the dichotomy will exist to that degree and impinge upon him in numerous ways that he does not understand. The man who disregards his conscience and continually violates what he knows to be a decent and proper code of ethics is gradually committing suicide. Soon, if he is unable to get his wheels back on track, he will avoid responsibility for his own happiness by blaming anyone or anything but himself. So our bedeviled young man, less happy by the day and more desperate by the hour, justified his violations of his code of ethics as necessary to regain the happiness he had lost. But they were not necessary. Nor did his transgressions pass unnoticed. He noticed. But he also decided that he could still live with himself. Undoubtedly he can. He has no choice. He will, though, pay dearly for the privilege. Like some primitive life form clinging to a fallen leaf being swept ever deeper into the belly of a whirlpool, the more he transgressed against his fellow man, the more his actions rebounded upon him, the more difficult life became, the more unhappiness he experienced, the more justified he felt in having to violate his own code again to try to be happy and, later, to try to avoid becoming more unhappy. Life, he concluded, was just not fair. Anyone can identify him in an instant. He has become the put-upon, luckless, sorrowful soul plagued by some evil star who trudges through the years with a burdensome load upon his bowed head and shoulders, shrouded in a heavy black toga emblazoned with a blood-red V for victim. Without the benefit of the genius formula, society empathizes, sympathizes, and puzzles over the unfairness of life. But society is wrong. Life did not do it to our subject. He did it to himself. He is only a victim of his own decisions, unethical acts, and irresponsibility for them. Beyond that, there is only justification, irresponsibility, and blame. His fourth major mistake was his decision that happiness, something that he desired to have, was dependent upon what he did and did not have, rather than upon what he did. And it was the final nail in his coffin. While position, objects, and other things might have brought him temporary satisfaction, they would never result in lasting happiness. It was not a lack of those things that caused his unhappiness. He did not have those things when he was happy as a child. His unhappiness was caused solely by his own choice of actions and inaction. Well, is it possible for him ever to be truly happy again? Certainly, but not on the course he is traveling. It is as possible as he makes it so by following this specific 7-step process. Number 1, he must realize that it is easier to do what it takes to be happy than to exist unhappily. Number 2, he must confront that his happiness was eroded from himself by only himself. Number 3, he must organize a specific and sensible ethical code that he is willing to follow at all times. and then do so. Number 4. He must ensure that his code includes being kind and helpful to others. Number 5. He must freely dream his own dreams as he chooses, whenever he chooses. Number 6. He must realize that all the happiness he will ever have is the happiness he decides to create. Number 7. He must realize that his happiness is dependent upon the things he does, not the things he has, or what has happened to him. Now, did you notice that none of the rules require the attainment of money or material possessions? In the latter part of the 19th century, United States politicians conveniently broke nearly every treaty with the American Indians. In addition, with the help of missionaries' families, they soon broke another treaty with Great Britain and France that guaranteed the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Hawaii. In an unjustifiable act of war, they called in the military, imprisoned Queen Liliuokalani in her own palace, and forcefully and illegally overthrew that Polynesian nation. The United States Congress formally apologized 100 years later, in 1993. In truth, all of these acts were committed to criminally seize these Native Americans' assets. As those obsessed with visions of vast real estate schemed greedily, they used the press to characterize the American Indians, who physically tried to defend their land, as subhuman savages to justify their extermination. Hawaiians, who did not resist physically, were referred to as, quote, our little brown children, unquote, to justify their unethical dominance by their great father, read Congress, in Washington, D.C. Chief Sitting Bull, the peaceful leader of the Sioux Nation, understood what he was up against. He said, quote, I never told my people not to trust the Americans. I told them the truth, that the Americans are big liars, unquote. The chief's well-intended response was to offer the government that sought his land a sagely warning. Quote, don't be a fool by becoming a slave to a fat piece of bacon, unquote. Did the government consider Chief Sitting Bull's advice? Not on your life. It was real estate, not wisdom, that the white man sought. The U.S. cavalry's response was to assassinate this enlightened man of peace by covertly shooting him in the back of his head. Chief Sitting Bull, however, was right. Neither vast real estate, dazzling jewels, luxurious automobiles, immense yachts, nor incalculable cash ever result in lasting happiness. Now, there is nothing necessarily wrong with attaining them, and they may be quite enjoyable playthings in the short term, but don't ever commit the mistake of thinking they are anything more than that. All the money that you will ever obtain is not worth the wisdom contained in this single sentence. When all the gold has been panned from all the streams of life, the one who can toss his entire share back into the water and laugh the heartiest wins. If the genius formula indicates true happiness is not to be found in material possessions but in actions, then actions directed toward what? Well, obviously the answer is not objects, which leaves other people, husbands, wives, children, relatives, and friends. Lasting happiness is found in meaningful relationships with others, in friendship. Let's look for the secret. Accumulating friends is like collecting wild mushrooms. You will discover them in a broad assortment of sizes, shapes, and colors as they appear in abundance from nowhere under the most favorable conditions, only to have them vanish utterly in foul weather. Moreover, a careless evaluation of either a mushroom or a friend can easily prove to be not only unpalatable, but downright deadly. Since the ability to distinguish friend and foe can considerably affect the course of anyone's life, it would seem that people long ago would have developed and refined workable techniques to evaluate the potential friendships of others. Unfortunately, that does not seem to have been the case. Too often we fail to identify our best of friends until golden opportunities are lost, and our worst of enemies until most of the damage is done. Let's look at what really does and does not constitute a friend. Each human on earth either essentially supports or opposes your survival, thereby identifying himself by his own actions as either your friend or enemy. It does not matter whether you have been formally introduced to a person or are totally unaware of his existence. By his words and acts, he either directly or indirectly tends to support or else oppose your basic purpose, your happiness, and the intentions you hold dear in every sector of your life. It is he who decides whether he is being your friend or not. Now, from that standpoint, you are probably blessed with far more friends and cursed with more enemies than you ever suspected. Simultaneously, by your comments and other acts, you are either being a friend or an enemy to each of the other inhabitants of this planet at this moment. It does not matter whether the other person is good or bad. It does not matter whether he is right or wrong. It does not matter whether he is being friend or foe to you. What any one of them has ever said or done is not the determining factor. You are. The role that you play is the role that you choose. Of course, there are also degrees of you being a friend and of someone being a friend to you. Occasionally in the course of life, usually when and where you least expect it, you will encounter more than just another friend, a true friend. Like the wild mushroom, such a person may be of any size, shape, or color, and will seem to pop up from nowhere. There are certain characteristics, however, by which he or she can be readily identified more easily than a succulent mushroom. A true friend gives you the benefit of any doubt. He knows there is no justice between those who do not. A true friend is honest in his relations with you. He does not try to mislead you into believing matters of importance that he thinks are not true. A true friend always keeps his word. He knows that his trustworthiness depends on it. A true friend is considerate of your feelings. He knows that there is no friendship in the absence of compassion. A true friend is able to maintain confidence. Nothing destroys the fabric of friendship like betrayal. A true friend offers his best advice but allows you to make your own decisions. He knows that no one should try to live your life for you. A true friend allows you to have your own opinions. He does not demand that you agree with him to remain your friend. A true friend speaks and acts with sincerity. What he says about you in your absence, he would be willing to repeat in your presence. A true friend encourages you to uphold your ethics. He knows that your happiness depends upon your actions directed toward yourself and others. A true friend sets an ethical example. If he can influence your behavior, he ensures that it is for the best. A true friend discourages you from doing anything unhealthy. He cares about your welfare and knows that you must be a friend to yourself first. A true friend is forgiving. He accepts a sincere apology as readily as he would want another to accept his own. A true friend is an inspiration. His very existence helps to make life a delightful experience. A true friend remains a friend regardless of the circumstances. A friend who chooses to be here today and gone tomorrow never really was. A true friend is more concerned with giving than receiving, and more interested in being a friend than in having one. Even so, the single most fundamental characteristic of any true friend, and the one most treasured through the ages, is simply the willingness to allow another to be himself without insisting that he change to become or continue to be acceptable. In one sentence, that is the secret not only of maintaining any meaningful friendship, but also of allowing it the opportunity to develop originally and to strengthen through the years. Now, most people with the potential to become your finest friends don't happen to circulate in your narrow stratum. They have their own religious practices. They belong to different generations. They are members of other races. For every person whom you know, there are more than 10,000 people whom you have never met. Don't sell them all short. You never know when a smile, a kind word, and the chance for someone to know you better may prove to be the start of something special. Here is one example. Among the truest of friendships was one born in the American Midwest in 1921 between Buster, an illiterate and mentally handicapped field hand, and James, the sympathetic and understanding farmer for whom he worked. Not only was Buster entirely lacking in formal education, but although he could speak somewhat, he was unable to carry on any semblance of a normal conversation with others. It is doubtful that he could have eked out more than the most pitiable existence without some ever-present helping hand. From their first meeting, James and his wife Mary accepted Buster as a full-fledged member of their family. In return for his room and board, Buster soon learned to help, to the limits of his abilities, with the never-ending tasks of farm life, realizing his happiness from the knowledge that he was able to contribute something of value to the lives of those whom he grew to love. Under James' patient guidance, he learned to round up the cattle each morning, entirely on his own, and herd them along the roadway to their pasturage, dutifully closing and latching each gate behind him along the way. Later, each afternoon, he drove them back again, separated the cows for James, and bunched them in the milking shed. So it was in the heart of the aging farmer that Buster found the source of compassion upon which he thrived, and it was by the joy in the field hand's eyes that James was abundantly repaid. I wasn't there, you understand, but according to those who were, through the years, Buster and James co-created a relationship of trust, respect, and understanding that is often dreamed about, though seldom realized. There are many who can tell you that the sincerity of their friendship and admiration for each other is well remembered to this day. The depth of their alliance can only be justly conveyed by telling you about some of the events that occurred after the friendship might normally have been considered to have ended. For early on the morning of May 12, 1928, when the wild forget-me-nots were in bloom, and only 7.5 years after their bond had been formed, James fell ill and died. Yet the heart and soul of their friendship lived on, and indeed flourished. Buster refused to leave James' bedside throughout his illness, and even remained with his friend after the body was coffined. But Buster was devastated. After the funeral, alone in a shattered world, he silently followed the slow-moving procession of friends and neighbors as they carried his beloved friend up the sloping fields to lay him to rest in the country cemetery on the hilltop. As the remains of James were lowered into the earth, however, the thought of eternal separation was more than Buster's heart could bear, and he screamed in utter frustration as Mary restrained him from entering the grave. Later, when the interment was completed, Buster steadfastly refused to leave, even after the lingering widow had departed with the daylight, and after the wild flowers had paled in the moonlight. Much later, as the neighboring farmhouses blinked their window shades against the rising sun, and as ghostly wisps of smoke began to curl from their chimneys, Buster still knelt upon the mound, motionless, and there he remained. Unable to alleviate his loss in normal conversation with other grieving family members, Buster was unrelenting in his determination to pay his deepest respects in the only way he knew to the only person who had really understood him. Buster maintained his vigil at the grave every day and every night through scorching sun and drenching rain, accepting only a drink of water from the widow once or twice a day, and with no other acknowledgment of her presence. Buster was oblivious to his body's demands for food and to the continual pleadings of Mary to consider his own health and welfare. And so the days passed. Soon journalists began to circulate the story of the destitute field hand who was starving himself to death on the grave of James. Then their readers began to arrive at the farm from miles around, just to glimpse from a distance this living skeleton, and to become a small part of a strange dedication they could scarcely comprehend. It was not until the latter part of May, more than 2 weeks after the death of James, that Buster finally consented to accept a token of nourishment, but he still could not be coerced to leave the grave. Throughout the spring and into the early summer, the meals that Mary prepared and carried to him each day, up the sloping fields to the family cemetery on the hill, seemed to be his only thread to life. And so the ritual continued. Then one day in late July, after more than 2 months at the grave, Buster returned from the hilltop to resume his responsibilities about the farm. The cattle were herded, the gates were dutifully latched, and the throngs of curious spectators soon dwindled to only a few. Yet in spite of his concessions to life, there was no weakening of his purpose. For every morning, as soon as he had completed his chores, his solitary figure could be seen trudging across the countryside in the distance, along the path tracked by the funeral procession to the country cemetery on the hill. There, beside the grave, he would kneel again, in honor of his departed friend, until the tombstone's lengthening shadow would interrupt his reveries and remind him that it was time to return the cows for their early evening milking. After the early frosts of autumn had chilled the summer greens into golds and fuchsia flaming reds, deep winter snows soon obscured the well-worn path that had guided him across the fields each day, and back again. But Buster did not mind. He knew the trail well. Sometimes, when other duties about the farm required frequent attention, he had to shuffle back and forth several times a day through deep snow. Nevertheless, whenever there was even an hour to spare, he could invariably be found beside the grave of James. And so the months passed. And so the years passed. Then, in the summer of 1932, after more than 1,500 days and nights of continual pilgrimage, His relentless vigil again captured the attention of newspaper reporters across America, along with the press photographers, the curious, and the skeptical. They arrived from every direction in the nation just to stare at Buster as he returned to the cemetery, as he pined away the hours, as he slept throughout each night beside the grave of James. During his 6th year of mourning, in 1933, Buster's advancing age and rheumatism began to take their toll. Sometimes he could only manage to limp part way up the slope before his aching muscles and searing joints compelled him to delay his journey until he could partially recoup his strength. It was during moments such as those, with the air still and the countryside at peace, that Mary leaned against the doorway to the back porch and pondered the friendship between Buster and James, and the joys of days that had passed, and the sounds of Buster crying unrestrainedly in the distance. In his unwavering commitment, and by some means known only to himself, Buster hobbled, staggered, and eventually even crawled all the way to James' grave at least once a day, every day, for 3 more years. Finally, though the spirit still compelled, the aged body could no longer respond. One afternoon, James' sons, Richard and Clyde, found him halfway along the path to the cemetery, where he had collapsed in complete exhaustion. With tears in their eyes, they carried him back to the farmhouse to comfort him as best they knew how. For the first time in more than 8 years, Buster's unalterable devotion had not been enough. After the family had retired for the evening, Mary was awakened several times by the sounds of Buster weeping in the night. Yet even as the stars shone serenely overhead, Buster was determined to complete his daily pilgrimage and die, if he must, upon the grave of James. But it was not to be. As the dawn was breaking on April 1, 1936, Richard discovered Buster alongside the path through the fields where the wild forget-me-nots were in bloom, on the way to James' grave, dead in a ditch. Buster's coffin was gently lowered into the earth of the farmland, as reporters throughout the United States rushed the final chapter into print, but none truly understood Buster's devotion that was born of simple friendship, yet somehow transcended death. Whatever this simple, itinerant field hand lacked in normal human abilities, he made up for as a friend, indeed. In the end, Buster was destined to rest no closer to James than at the edge of the fields of the wild forget-me-nots, next to the cemetery fence. That, they said, was as near as the law would allow. You see, James S. Van Court, of Richmond, Ohio, was my great-granduncle, and the ever-faithful Buster was his old Scotch collie. Like this story, the friendship was true. In fact, if you review the list of 15 characteristics of a true friend, you will realize that within the bounds of his abilities, Buster displayed them all. Expressly, a dog is supportive, honest, trustworthy, kind, reliable, respectful, courteous, sincere, decent, exemplary, helpful, forgiving, inspirational, loyal, and giving. Further, a dog is quite non-judgmental, inherently allowing you to be yourself without insisting that you change to become or continue to be acceptable. The most fundamental characteristic of a true friend. Is there any wonder man considers a dog his best friend? And it's merely a dog. Isn't it ironic that such a primitive and supposedly uncultured life form should naturally display to humans, not even of its own species, all these admirable qualities that are so often absent even in our world leaders? Isn't it further ironic that these characteristics include kindness and courteousness, from the Latin civilis, that denotes civilized conduct? Unfortunately, in America alone, these neighboring life forms are currently being legally destroyed at the rate of more than 7 million annually. Well, let us at least learn a valuable lesson from these lesser beings, who display the same qualities that are mirrored by superior intelligence and civilized behavior, by accepting their legacy. Let us all decide to be a true friend to ourselves and every other human being, and cultivate the characteristics of it. Magically, we will almost immediately be rewarded with a reflection of the happiness we will be creating for others. It works. Try it. It is the intelligent answer.